We set out early, the morning mist still clinging to the base of the trees. The forest swallowed the sun in thick, towering pines, their canopies stretching into an unbroken ceiling of green. The trail, barely more than a dirt path, wound its way deeper into the woods, a thin scar cut through the wilderness. The world outside the forest faded quickly, replaced by the sound of crunching leaves and the rhythmic thud of boots against earth. At first, everything felt normal, peaceful even. The scent of damp wood, the occasional rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush, the distant caw of a bird. It was the kind of wilderness people paid money to escape to. It wasn't until we had been walking for hours that the silence settled in. Not true silence, but something close to it. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping insects, singing birds, had thinned out until there was only the wind, threading itself through the trees in a breathless hush. The deeper we ventured, the more suffocating the air became. The path narrowed, weaving between trunks that seemed to press in on either side, and the sunlight that filtered through the branches above grew dimmer, as though the forest itself was darkening. Something felt wrong. It was a creeping unease, nothing tangible at first, just a growing sense of displacement, as if the trees were subtly shifting when we weren't looking. The air carried a damp chill, thick with the scent of moss and decay. Even our footsteps seemed muted, swallowed by the forest floor. We kept walking, but the unease spread like a slow infection. The trees, once familiar, began to take on a sameness that made it difficult to gauge distance. Had we passed that gnarled oak before? Was that fallen log the same one we had stepped over 20 minutes ago? The further we went, the more the trail seemed to fold in on itself, sending us back through places we swore we had already been. The GPS was the first to fail. One by one, the screens blinked out, the icons freezing in place, refusing to refresh. No signal, no location. The trail, which had been clearly marked in the morning, now seemed to dissolve into the undergrowth, splitting into smaller paths that led nowhere. Dusk crept in without warning. One moment, the light had been golden, slanting through the branches. The next, the shadows had lengthened, turning the forest into an endless sprawl of blackened trunks and shifting darkness. That was when the wind changed. It wasn't just the temperature that dropped, it was the sound. A breeze moved through the trees, but it carried something with it, something just beneath the rustling leaves. It took a moment to register. A whisper. At first, it was easy to dismiss as the sigh of the wind through hollow spaces, a trick of acoustics in the trees. But as it persisted, threading its way through the forest, it became something else. A low, fragmented murmur, rising and falling in waves, barely audible. The words were just out of reach, foreign yet familiar, like a forgotten dream. The air seemed thicker, charged with something unseen. The trees loomed impossibly tall, their branches intertwining overhead in tangled, skeletal fingers. Every sound became amplified. The crunch of leaves, the shifting of fabric, the unsteady breaths we weren't aware we had been holding. Something about the whispers made it impossible to ignore them. They came from nowhere and everywhere at once, drifting between the trees, brushing against the edges of hearing. They weren't urgent, nor were they menacing. They were simply there, pressing in from all sides like unseen figures standing just beyond the light. The sense of direction unraveled completely. Every attempt to backtrack led us in a loop, bringing us back to the same cluster of trees, the same fallen log, the same warped, knotted roots that jutted from the earth like grasping hands. Panic was a quiet thing at first, just a tension in the air, a shifting of weight from foot to foot. But as the last light drained from the sky, swallowed by the endless canopy above, the whispers grew louder. And then, for the first time, they said something we could understand. "Don't look behind you." A gust of wind slammed through the trees, and the fire we had only just started to build guttered violently, its flames twisting sideways before snuffing out entirely. Darkness closed in. The fire crackled to life, weak at first, before licking hungrily at the dry wood. It pushed back the darkness, but only just beyond the flickering light. The forest loomed, dense and watchful. The whispers had faded for now, but their absence was almost worse. It felt deliberate, like something waiting. Laughter drifted up, forced and hollow, an attempt to beat back the unease that clung to the air. No one spoke of the strange moment before the fire had gone out, nor the words that had seemed to emerge from the wind itself. It was easier to pretend the nerves were nothing more than exhaustion, that the twisting trees and creeping shadows were products of an overactive imagination. The night deepened, the sky above consumed by the tangled branches overhead. The fire was the only thing that felt real. The warmth, the soft crackling, the way the embers pulsed like something living. Beyond it, the forest felt infinite. One of them had a recorder, the kind used for capturing ambient sounds. They held it up to the night, smirking as if to prove there was nothing to fear. The logic was simple. Replay the recording, hear nothing unusual, and put this whole thing to rest. It was just the wind, after all. The whispers were back before anyone noticed. Not a slow return, but sudden, as if they had never left at all. They came in waves, rustling through the leaves, curling around the edges of the camp like unseen figures just out of reach. The trees seemed closer than before, not by much, but enough to notice. A shift in the landscape that hadn't been there earlier. The distance between them and the fire felt compressed, as if the forest itself were closing in, inch by inch. The paranoia settled in gradually, a growing awareness of movement that never quite aligned with reality. Shadows stretched in the firelight, shifting in ways they shouldn't. The trees, swaying in a non-existent wind, seemed to lean in when backs were turned. There was something else, too. A presence. Not seen, but felt just outside the ring of light, watching. The recorder was played back. The firelight flickered, and the sound of the forest filled the small speaker. The crackling of the fire, the occasional shuffle of movement. And then, beneath it all, something else. The whispering. Not the rustling of trees, not the wind threading its way through the branches. Voices. Low, urgent, overlapping in a sound that was not meant for human ears. The words were foreign at first, too distorted to recognize, but then, "Don't look behind you." The fire seemed to shrink at that moment, like something had stolen the oxygen from the air. The darkness pressed in, deeper, heavier, suffocating in its weight. The heat from the flames no longer reached as far. A sound broke through the stillness. A rustling. Something moving just beyond the fire's glow. Not the normal sounds of the forest. No scurrying animal. No shifting of branches in the wind. This was deliberate. Close. The fire flickered violently, the shadows around it stretching unnaturally long. The rustling stopped. No one turned around. The silence was unbearable, stretched taut like a hell breath. The words from the recording still echoed in the air, sinking deep into the marrow of the moment. "Don't look behind you." The fire guttered again, the flames shuddering low. Something was there. It hadn't moved. It hadn't left. It was waiting. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. The fire flared back to life, as if whatever had been lingering at the edges had taken a step back, slipping once more into the unseen places between the trees. The moment passed, but the forest did not return to what it had been. Something had shifted, something irreversible. The night stretched on, the darkness deeper than it had been before. The trees, impossibly tall, stood silent and still. The fire burned on, its flickering light no longer a comfort, but a fragile, fleeting barrier. No one turned around. The whispers never stopped. They rose and fell like waves, seeping into the spaces between thought and dream. The fire had burned low, its embers pulsing weakly against the darkness. The night had stretched on, endless and suffocating, thick with the sensation of being watched. The air itself felt heavy, pressing in with a quiet insistence, as if the forest were leaning closer. No one slept, or at least, no one remembered sleeping. Time unraveled in slow, disjointed moments, shadows shifting at the edge of vision, the flickering of the dying fire, the ceaseless whispering that never quite formed words. At some point, The night began to fold in on itself, turning dreamlike and formless. A cold, creeping awareness settled in. They were not alone. When the first light bled into the sky, pale and sickly through the canopy, the whispers faded. Not all at once, but gradually, as though something had decided it had said enough. The fire was little more than ash and charwood. The forest, in the thin light of dawn, looked almost normal. Almost. It took too long to notice the missing person. The sleeping bag lay undisturbed, zipped up neatly, as if he had never been there at all. No sign of struggle. No footprints leading away. Just an empty space where a person should have been. Panic came slow, numbed by exhaustion. There was no explanation, no trail to follow. The earth where he had slept was untouched. The only sign that anything had changed was the absence itself. A hollow, silent thing that settled in their stomachs like cold stone. The forest had shifted overnight. It wasn't immediately obvious, but the deeper they looked, the more wrong it became. Paths they had walked yesterday no longer existed, replaced by tangled roots and dense undergrowth. Trees stood where there should have been open space. The landscape folded in on itself, warping, bending. The feeling of being watched had not left. If anything, it had intensified. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against their backs, a presence just beyond the range of sight. The trees stood too still, their branches interwoven like fingers locked in a silent grip. The air was thick with something unseen, something patient. The search felt futile, but they moved anyway, pushing through the unfamiliar terrain, the twisted paths that led nowhere. It was deep in the forest, too far from where the camp should have been, that they found the backpack. It dangled from a branch, torn open, the fabric shredded. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of unease crawling up their spines. The zipper was broken, its teeth bent outward, as if something had pried it open with unnatural force. Inside, the contents were scattered, half-empty water bottles, a flashlight with a cracked lens. And at the very bottom, barely visible beneath a crumpled map, a scrap of paper. The writing was hurried, almost frantic, the ink smudged and uneven. They are learning your names. The wind moved through the trees, bringing the whispering back with it. It coiled around the clearing, threading through the branches like fingers combing through hair. They ran. It was instinct, a primal need to escape, to push away from the unseen thing lurking just beyond the veil of trees. The forest blurred around them, branches snagging at their clothes, roots rising up beneath their feet. The whispering swelled, rising and falling, voices overlapping, pulling at the edges of reason. One of them stumbled, hesitated for just a moment, glancing back. That was all it took. He was there 1 second, mid-step, his breath coming in ragged gasps. And then he wasn't. No sound, no straged, just absence, like the forest had swallowed him whole. The space where he had been stood empty, untouched, as if he had never existed at all. The whispers surged, filling the void he left behind. The trees leaned closer, the air thick with something unspeakable. Something was watching, and it was getting closer. The forest closed in. The air was thick, too dense to breathe properly, clinging to skin like damp cloth. The whispering had grown relentless, curling around them in layers of sound, shifting in tone, pleading, mocking, warning. The words had no shape, yet they pressed into their skulls as if meaning was being forced inside. Panic had shattered what little sense of unity remained. Staying together meant waiting for the forest to pick them off one by one. The only choice was to run. Feet pounded against the uneven ground, slipping on damp leaves, catching on unseen roots. The trees blurred, streaking past in a darkened rush. The sound of fleeing bodies scattered in every direction, the gasps of breath swallowed by the whispering that did not wane. It was everywhere now, not just in the air, but in the bones, pressing against the inside of the skull like something trying to get in. The forest twisted, shifting with every turn. No path lasted longer than a moment before it bent into something unfamiliar, warping into dead ends and walls of tangled undergrowth. No direction was safe. The narrator ran, pushing forward even as their muscles burned, lungs straining against the cold, wet air. The ground sloped downward, leading them deeper, always deeper, until their legs could take no more. They collapsed into a clearing, falling hard against the damp earth. The world spun, the whispering surging and retreating like a tide. The trees around them seemed to shift with each breath, their trunks flexing, their bark rippling as if they were alive, breathing. The presence in the air thickened. It was not just heard, but felt. It pressed in from all sides, brushing against skin like unseen fingers, threading through hair, wrapping around limbs with phantom weight. The whispering was no longer distant. It was inside them now, weaving through their ribs, pooling behind their eyes. Then the voice came. From the darkness beyond the trees, their own voice spilled out. Warp wrong. It played in broken fragments, torn from a recorder that had been used the night before. It should have been a recording of the wind, of the forest noises they had tried to capture. But instead, it spoke. It spoke words they had never said. A confession that had never left their lips. A secret buried deep, wrenched into the open with unnatural clarity. The words stretched, distorted, growing unfamiliar even as they heard themselves saying them. A sound like wet fabric peeling apart echoed in the clearing. The narrator looked down. Their shadow had split. Multiple forms stretched away from them, peeling off the ground like ink dissolving in water. They stood, but their shadows did not rise with them. They remained on the forest floor, shifting, untethered, beginning to move on their own. The darkness deepened. The whispering turned urgent. The first shadow stepped away, then another, then all of them. The presence in the clearing thickened, the trees bending in, the air pressing against their lungs. The shadows did not return. They walked into the trees, vanishing one by one, leaving the narrator standing alone. And the whispering did not stop. The forest had no end. The trees stretched in all directions, identical and unyielding, their gnarled limbs reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. The air was thick, stagnant, and humming with something unseen. The whispering had grown quieter, but not weaker. It was everywhere, murmuring just beneath the surface of reality, laced into the very fabric of the world. The narrator moved forward, though they could no longer tell if they were walking or if the forest was shifting around them. There was no path, no destination, only the sense that they were being led somewhere. The ground pulsed faintly beneath their feet, like something buried deep below was stirring. Shapes flickered at the edges of vision, impossibly fast and soundless. The shadows had never returned, and yet they could feel them, walking just beyond the trees, watching. Then, the clearing appeared. At first, it seemed unfamiliar, just another stretch of forest in the endless maze. But then the narrator saw it, the fire. It burned exactly as it had on the first night, its flames flickering against the encroaching dark. The sight of it sent a cold rush through their body. The fire should have died out long ago. And then they saw the others. The missing hikers stood by the flames, perfectly still. Their faces were blank, drained of all expression, their eyes dull and unfocused. Their bodies were rigid, locked in place as if they had been standing there for years. A scream clawed at the narrator's throat, but no sound came out. The whispering surged, rising in intensity, filling the space where their voice should have been. It seeped into their head, drowning out thought, washing over everything. Something was wrong. Something had always been wrong. The realization struck like ice through the chest. The forest was not a place they had entered. It was a place they had always been. They never left. The memories unraveled, folding in on themselves. The first day, the first night, had they even happened? Or had they always been here, standing in the firelight, watching, waiting? The narrator staggered back, shaking, trying to force breath into their lungs. The whispers wrapped tighter around their mind, curling into familiar words, pressing a final message into their thoughts. You're a part of the forest now. Movement caught their eye. On the other side of the fire, another figure sat on a log, watching the flames. Their own face stared back at them. A smile curled at the edges of its lips, slow and knowing. The firelight danced in its eyes. The darkness surged forward. The forest closed in, and the whispering never stopped.